Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Winter 14 Release Preview webinar. My name is Sandeep Hanod. I'm a Principal Developer Evangelist for Salesforce.com, joined this morning by my buddy and colleague, Ryan Upton. Morning, Ryan.
Good morning, Sandeep. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to come to you once again and go over our developer preview for Winter 14.
Awesome. So it's been a while since I've done one of these release preview webinars, but boy, have I chosen a good time to come back, Ryan. The Winter 14 release is really one for the ages. It's simply chock-a-block with awesome features for admins and developers alike. So we're both really excited to share some of those features with you today. This is our China Safe Harbor slide. Please make any buying decisions on currently available products and features, not on any forward-looking statements we might make today. That's us in all our glory, Cloudy San, and at Ryan Upton if you want to follow us on Twitter. Speaking of Twitter, if you're not doing so already, please follow us on all these social media channels, Twitter, Facebook, Google+. We're on all of them. It really is a great way to keep abreast the latest and greatest on the Force.com platform. So highly encourage that you join us or follow us if you're not doing so already. Here's what we have in tap for the next hour. I'm going to kick us off with some great Visualforce updates we have in Winter 14. Follow that up with some Apex updates. Ryan is then going to talk us through some Canvas updates and miscellaneous updates, and then we're going to wrap up with security updates and Q&A. All right, so let's start with some great Visualforce HTML5 updates. Now, one of the key goals of Visualforce has always been to let developers use the latest and greatest web technologies. And HTML5 is the latest and greatest web technology. It's the standard that all future web apps will be based on. And we've been adding support for HTML5 in Visualforce over the last couple of releases. We started by introducing the HTML5 doc type attribute in about a year back, I believe. And then in the last release, we added the manifest attribute if you wanted to do some offline with HTML5. Now in Winter 14, we've added one new component and one new attribute that lets you use the new HTML5 form input types. Now, those who are unfamiliar with the new HTML input types is prior to HTML5, you basically had some very limited set of input types. You had the age-old text, password, and maybe the submit type, right? But HTML5 actually added a whole new slew of new input types. In total, I believe 12 of them, to capture specific input like email or telephone or date or search, etc. And with Winter 14, you can now use any one of those HTML5 input types in Visualforce, either via a brand new component called Apex Input that's been added in Winter 14, or you can use the new type attribute on the Apex Input field tag, which has been around for a while. So let's take a look at this in action with a quick demo, and then I'm going to do a code walkthrough of the Visualforce page. Is how I built that demo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a mobile optimized Visualforce page that I built on my iOS simulator. Now, the reason I chose a sort of a mobile use case here is HTML5, of course, is applicable for both mobile use cases as well as desktop use cases. So you can use these new Winter 14 features, whether you're building a mobile web app or a standard Visualforce desktop app. But HTML5, the newer input types really shine in a mobile use case, as you're about to see in a minute, which is why I chose this sort of mobile use case. All right, so the Visualforce itself, this page is really simple. It just shows you a list of contacts pulled in from your Salesforce org. If you're wondering where I'm getting those pictures from, I added a new custom field to the contact standard object of type rich text, and then I uploaded a couple of thumbnail images to that rich text field. So you can sort of drill into any contact record from that list page, and then also go ahead and edit any of the contact details on this edit page. Now, before I go on, just a quick note on this entire Visualforce page and how it looks. Now, Ryan, you probably know this best. I am a developer, which means my demos never ever look this slick, right?
Yeah.
Well, you could have waited a little bit more. You could have waited a little longer before agreeing with me, Ryan.
I was just sitting here wondering who you got to build that front end for you, man. That's
there you go. Yeah, the reason this particular demo is looking so slick and mobile optimized is because I'm using something called the mobile design templates in this Visualforce page. So mobile design templates is a set of 22 open source HTML5 and CSS3 templates that we released recently. And you can use these sort of templates as a starting point to build any mobile optimized Visualforce page. So we have templates for your standard use cases like list views that you see here, detail view, as well as sort of form input views that you're seeing here. These are all courtesy of the mobile design templates. So a great resource if you're doing mobile web development, check them out on developer.force.com. All right, back to our regularly scheduled programming. Let's talk about the new HTML5 input types. Now, the first field here on my contact record is pretty straightforward. It's a text field, right? So you see when I focus in on that field, it shows up the standard keypad.
Yep.
Things get a little bit more interesting, though, when I get to a date field like birth date on the contact. You can see here is how I'm being shown the native iOS date widget instead of the default Salesforce date picker widget that you're, I'm sure, used to seeing, right? And this is one of the key advantages of using some of these newer HTML5 input types is all modern browsers like mobile Safari as well as the Android default browser have some native widgets that help you input data like date, email, telephone, etc., much more efficiently using these newer HTML5 input types. So let me show you another example. That was a date field. Here's an email field, and you can see here in the keypad, I'm being shown the at symbol because again, it's an email field, and you always will have an at symbol in an email field. A telephone type field will show this keypad, all numeric because that's what you want to enter. A number field will show numbers instead of your alphanumeric characters. So one of the many reasons of using these newer HTML5 input types is this kind of behavior. And again, this demo is on iOS, but if you were to pull this Visualforce page on your Android or pretty much any smartphone really, you would see the corresponding widgets shown up for those respective fields as well. So that's really nice.
Very nice.
All right, now let's go ahead and look at the code for that Visualforce page. So the first thing you'll notice is, of course, the doc type. These newer input types can only be used with HTML5, so you're required to set the doc type as HTML5. Otherwise, you will not be able to use these newer input types. And you'll also notice I've turned off the standard style sheets, sidebar header, etc. for this page, mostly because it's a mobile optimized page. I want to keep it as lightweight as possible. You don't have to do this in order to use the newer input types, just what I did for this particular Visualforce page. You'll notice here how I'm inputting the mobile design templates that I just mentioned earlier, just a series of CSS and JavaScript that you have to import into your Visualforce page, and you're off and running. All right, let's scroll down all the way down to the section of the page that has to do with editing the contact that we just saw. So that's right here, output panel ID equals edit view. And in here, you'll see the first sort of instance of this new type attribute that's been added to Apex input field. Now, with this new type attribute, you can set this type to any one of those 12 HTML5 input types. And the full list of the new input types is in the release notes, so go check that out. But just real quickly, the couple of ones that I'm using here in this demo is of type text, which is obvious. Type auto, we're going to talk about that in a minute. Type date for a date field, obviously. Type email, type telephone or auto in this case, or type number, right? So that's just some of the newer types that you can now use. Now let's talk about this auto type for a minute here. So there are two ways you can use these newer input types. One is you can explicitly tell Visualforce exactly what type of input field you want displayed, right? Like telephone or email or date. Or you can just set it to auto and let Visualforce figure out the appropriate input type based on the database field that you're mapping or binding this input field to. So for example, in this case, I'm binding this particular input field to a number type field on my contact record. So Visualforce will automatically generate an input of type number when this Visualforce page is rendered, right? So you have both options. You can either let Visualforce try and figure it out, or you can be explicit and set the exact type of input field. And also another thing you can do is you can use this brand new component or tag that we've added in Winter 14 called Apex Input. So Apex Input field obviously can be used when you want to bind this field to an S object, like I'm here doing here with my contact record. However, if you want to bind your form to just some variable on your controller or extension class, you can use this Apex input tag instead, right? So again, you can use the type attribute to tell us what type of input you want displayed, and that type needs to match the type of variable that you have on your controller. So if you say type date, you need to bind it to a date type variable and your controller extension class, so on and so forth. So you can either use Apex input field with the new type attribute or the new Apex input tag. A couple of other things to point out. Along with using these input fields, HTML5 also defines certain attributes that let you sort of control the behavior of a particular input field a little bit more, on a little bit more fine-grained level. So here's an example: is HTML5 defines attributes like min and max for number type fields, right? If you want to have a validation check that you can only enter, values of a certain range into a number field, you can specify min and max. And with Visualforce, you can just append HTML to whatever attribute you want to pass through to your HTML input type, and it will simply be passed on through in the generated markup, right? So this is one way you can use these min and max HTML5 attributes. Here's another example. In my email field, I'm using an HTML5 attribute called pattern. That's a way to enforce a specific pattern for either an email or a text field. In this case, I'm saying you're only allowed to enter an email that ends with @salesforce.com, right? So another example of using Visualforce pass-through attribute to control the behavior of an input field. Let's quickly take a look at this in action. Let's go ahead and edit, and let's try and input email field or email value that doesn't match the required format. So as you can see here, when I try to submit the form, Chrome actually threw an error and said, it needs to match a particular pattern. Now, bear in mind that what I just said is important, that it's actually Chrome that's throwing that error. Visualforce is not enforcing this validation check, right? We just generate the HTML5 input type, and it's up to the specific browser to enforce that input type or display that input type. So in some ways, you're at the mercy of the browser. Different browsers have varying support for HTML5 currently. I would say Chrome is probably the best right now. Firefox is really good as well. Safari is a little bit further behind, and especially mobile Safari, which is why I didn't show this demo on my simulator. I showed it in my Chrome, because mobile Safari, for example, doesn't really enforce these pattern and min and max attributes that I wanted to show you. So be careful when you use these. Go ahead, Ryan.
I was saying, that's a very, very important point, Sandeep, about browser support that is easy to miss when looking at this from the Visualforce perspective.
Exactly. Make sure you test your page on the browsers that you intend to support for your Visualforce page. All right, so that's one example. Let me fix that one and show you another example. So the min and max value for this was 20. So let's try and do something more than 20. You'll see again, Chrome, had a validation, through a validation error. Another point about validation, using attributes like min, max, and pattern. These are merely client-side validations. These are not, you should not use these in lieu of any server-side validation. This should be used in addition to any server-side validation logic that you have. Never rely on these validation checks being enforced by the client or the browser, right? So you always should have validation checks either via Apex code or maybe a validation ruler or whatever you need on your database, on your Force.com side to enforce these rules. This is just sort of a nice to have additional layer of check. The user will save some time. We won't even let them, the browser won't let them submit the form till they fix these issues. But you should always have server-side validation logic as well.
So it doesn't replace validation. Got it.
No, it doesn't, as much as you would like it to. All right, one last point about the newer HTML5 support is we also have added support for something called data list, which is also part of the HTML5 standard. And data list is a neat way to support some simple autocomplete sort of type ahead type functionality. So what you can do is in a input field of type text or auto, you can basically add a comma separated list of values, which can either be static, like you see here, or you can bind it to a variable in your controller extension class. And what this will be translated to is the data list tag in HTML5. You can Google it and learn more about that. But here's what it does to your page is, since I've defined these as my possible values for this field, what I can do here is as soon as I start typing S, you can see how the browser shows those possible values, and it makes my life a little bit easier in terms of choosing possible values. If I do E, it'll show me English as one of the possible values, right? Or nothing that I needed to code up for in JavaScript or anything, or even in Visualforce for that matter. This is just the Chrome browser enforcing the HTML5 data list tag. So that's kind of nice to know as well. All right, so that's it on Apex input types. Now, Ryan, are you sitting down? Are you ready for this?
I am sitting down. I am totally prepared to be blown away by what's coming next.
All right, what's coming next is we're going to talk about server-side view state, which is a really new, exciting pilot feature in Winter 14. So bear in mind it's pilot, which means it's not enabled by default. So you need to contact Salesforce support to have it enabled. But here's what it lets you do is it basically lets you control the behavior of how view state works in Visualforce a little bit better. So let me explain. So let's start with what is view state for anybody who's unfamiliar with view state. View state is how Visualforce, and really any web page for that matter, maintains your server-side state between multiple browser requests, right? So on that Visualforce page I just showed you, I have a list of contacts that I'm iterating through on my controller side that I get through a SOQL query. I want to maintain that list of contacts as I'm, clicking through multiple contacts on my page. I want to have that state maintained. And the way Visualforce does it is via view state. And the default behavior of Visualforce up till Winter 14 was that view state was basically sent back and forth between the browser and our servers in every form submission. So that view state was basically encrypted and stored as a hidden field in our form, and it was submitted every time you hit any link or button on your Visualforce page. We would then, recreate your view state on our servers, and everything would work. With server-side view state, you can actually switch that behavior and have us maintain your view state on our servers in our databases. So instead of transferring that entire view state back and forth from the browser, all we do is with this pilot enabled, the Visualforce page of the browser simply sends back a unique ID to our servers, and in our servers, since we store your view state in our database, we can quickly query and recreate your view state for your specific Visualforce page really quickly. So it cuts down on the network traffic significantly between the browser and our servers with this pilot enabled, right? So your mileage will vary depending on the size and complexity of your Visualforce page. If you have a pretty big Visualforce page with a big component tree and or lots of data on the server side, you can see some significant performance improvements with this pilot. But if it's a pretty simple Visualforce page, you may not see that much of a difference, but it's definitely something worth checking out. So let me show you this in action because this is really cool. When I saw this in action the first time, I was like blown away. So here's my contact list Visualforce page that we've been looking at, right? Now here's a handy little tool for you to actually introspect there are other ways of doing this. Obviously, we have a view state tab that you can inspect the view state and see the size of view state. But here's a simple way of doing this, which is you just query this particular ID on your page. Now, this is the view state that's being transferred back and forth for this page in this org. You can see here the value is very, very minimal. It's basically all it is a unique ID that we then use on our server side to query our database and then recreate your entire view state for you. Now in this org, obviously I have that server side pilot enabled, which is why you're seeing such a limited size of view state, right? Now let me show you, let me toggle over to my Safari here. Here's another pre-release org that I built, a completely different one. You can see from the URL, it's a completely different pre-release org, except I have the exact same Visualforce page in this org, right? The exact same code. Let's compare the size of the view state here. In this org, I do not have server-side view state enabled. It is the default Visualforce behavior in this org. So in this org, let's copy paste our little hack here. You can see the size of the view state that's getting transferred back and forth in this Visualforce page. Wow. Right? Now just compare this size with something where server-side is enabled, and you get the idea. It really does cut down a lot on the network traffic, should help your page performance significantly if it's a reasonably complex Visualforce page.
Hey, Sandeep, so does this mean if I'm using server state on the server side then I no longer have a view state limit?
Aha, I'm glad you asked that. It's almost as if we rehearsed this, Ryan. No, the short answer is no. Even with server-side view state, it's important to remember you still have a view state for your page, and all the limits still apply. So the limits of, I believe it's 135 KB, that size limit for a view state still applies. The difference is instead of having that view state being transferred every time from the browser to our servers with every form submission, we're just storing that view state on our server side. But the size limit still applies, and more importantly, there is still view state. The view state hasn't disappeared. So keep that in mind. Using something like JS remoting will eliminate view state entirely, right? So server-side view state will still not be as performant as JS remoting because that doesn't have view state at all. But server-side view state should be more performant than the default for certain types of Visualforce pages. So really,
I like that though. I like that though because it still makes me focus and think about the efficient ways to do that, even though I'm not necessarily transferring that state back and forth.
Bingo, exactly. All right, next up, support for pass-through HTML attributes. We've actually already seen this in action. Let me bring up this page again. You already saw this in action, right? As I said, if you want to pass through any arbitrary attribute into your markup, you can simply append HTML dash to that name of the attribute in pretty much any Visualforce standard tag like input field or data list or whatever. That's not new in Winter 14. That's been around for a couple of releases. What's new in Winter 14 is we've significantly enhanced the number of standard components that support these pass-through attributes, right? So it's that much more easier now to use Visualforce along with MVC framework like jQuery Mobile, AngularJS, or Knockout. All of these modern MVC frameworks, JavaScript MVC frameworks, heavily rely on HTML data attributes in particular. And now with this pass-through attribute, it's that much easier to combine Visualforce with any one of those frameworks. So here's another example. Here's a Knockout page that I built using the Knockout.js MVC framework. And you can see here in my Apex data table tag, I simply need to pass through data bind. This is an attribute that Knockout uses to bind data. Again, the details are not important. What's important is I can simply add HTML in front of that attribute, and that will simply be passed through by Visualforce to the final markup on the page. And you can use this with Knockout, Angular, Backbone, or whatever MVC framework of choice. So that's really nice.
Which is, interestingly enough, where we're pointing a lot of our developers toward, especially with our mobile developer packs. So it's nice to see that this is going to fit well within that.
It's not even us so much pushing. It's just that's the way the web development community is moving, right? That's the future. These JavaScript MVC frameworks are great. So now it's that much easier to work with them in Visualforce.
Yeah,
all right, next up.
Recommending is better than pushing.
Indeed. Next up, deferred loading of JavaScript via a new attribute called load on ready. So the default behavior up till Winter 14 was anytime you added Apex include script tag in your Visualforce page, Visualforce added that to the head section of the HTML5 markup, which means that every browser will wait to load that particular script and execute it before it continues with its DOM generation and manipulation. So it was kind of a blocking synchronous behavior so far. But now if you set this new attribute load on ready to true, Visualforce will actually defer loading this particular script till after the DOM is finished loading in the browser, right? So if you have any JavaScript that can wait that you don't need for the initial page load or initialization, you can now significantly improve your page performance, at least the initial load performance, by deferring loading of those scripts to after the DOM has been loaded. So let me show you this in action real quickly. Let's go back to our contact list page. And up on top, I have a very simple static resource called load on ready test. Let's save this guy. And while I'm waiting for that, let me actually show you what this load on ready test static resource does. It's actually very simple. All it is alert. All it does is throw an alert when we do it. So now I have a new static resource, right, which just has an alert in it. But right now I'm defaulting to load on ready false, which means it's basically back to its default behavior, which is it will wait to load the script and run it before the rest of the page loads. So let's see this in action. Let's go back and load this page up again. You can see here my script is being loaded and it's waiting to execute my script before the rest of the Visualforce page renders and shows up. Now let's change this behavior to true and actually defer loading of this script till after my DOM is done loading. Save that up. Now you can see my script was actually loaded up after the DOM had finished loading and showing up on the browser. So significant improvement in terms of performance, right? So
yeah,
that's
big difference.
Big difference. So again, this is not for every script. Obviously, if you need some JavaScript that you need in order to actually initialize and load the page itself, then obviously you can't defer loading of it. But if you have cases where it can be deferred, this new attribute is pretty handy. All right, before I move on, I don't know if you noticed this, Ryan, but I was actually able to show you that static resource and even edit it right in Developer Console. So
I was
that's
wondering
actually,
about that.
Yeah, I'm sure you were. So let me talk about that. There are actually some great new additions to Developer Console in this release. This is probably my favorite one, where you can now actually both create and edit static resources directly from the Developer Console, right? So you no longer have to toggle back and forth. I can create a JavaScript static resource, name it whatever I want, and just directly edit it here in the console, see the results right away. That really saves a ton of time. Here's another one. You can phenomenal, exactly. Here's another one. You can now have consolidated search across all your files. So all your Apex, all your Visualforce, all objects, everything, you can have one consolidated search. So let me just say selected contact. I think that's one of my variables that I use pretty much heavily in this page. You can see here, it shows you references to that variable across my Visualforce page, my Apex class, pretty much everything. So that's really handy.
Sandeep, does this choose search across metadata also, or just your code?
I believe it does both code and metadata, actually. So that's really nice. There's a new view state inspector directly in Dev Console. You don't have to go to your browser to see the view state. In the query editor, you can run SOSL queries now in addition to SOQL queries. And there's a ton of other great updates to the Developer Console that everybody should go check out. All right, I hope you're still sitting, Ryan, because I have another doozy for you.
I just sat back down because I was anticipating.
All right, good timing. Now, the statement governor limit. We used to have this, there was a limit on number of Apex scripts that you could execute in a given transaction. That has now been removed entirely in Winter 14. We haven't increased the limit. We've just entirely removed it. So prior to Winter 14, you had like 20K number of lines of Apex code you could execute in synchronous and 1 million in asynchronous. Now that limit is entirely gone. So that's
I think I hear trumpets blowing in celebration over this one, Sandeep.
The crowd goes wild, and rightly so. This is probably my favorite feature of of this entire release is this removing of this limit. Now, a couple of things to point out is we're still in a multi-tenant environment here, right? So we do need some way of monitoring and making sure one tenant doesn't affect the performance of another tenant. So what we've done in Winter 14, starting in Winter 14, is instead we're going to look at the amount of CPU time that your code takes to execute. And we have currently a limit of 10 seconds for synchronous Apex. That's the amount of CPU time that your code has to run, and 60 seconds for asynchronous Apex, like batch and future methods. Again, a couple of clarifications here that are important. When I say CPU time, what I mean is actual time spent running your Apex code. It does not include time spent running DML statements or doing SOQL queries or SOSL queries, etc. All database operations are excluded from the CPU timer, as well as Apex callouts, right? If you have your code that's waiting for an external web service, we don't penalize you for that. That's not counted against that 10 or 60-second limit either. So that's great. It's literally the time spent running your Apex code.
Yeah, that's huge. I was getting
huge, right?
Yeah, I was getting a little concerned that I had some queries that run like 90 seconds or more, but I don't have to worry about it now. Like, that's great.
Well, if your queries run for 90 seconds, Ryan, you have a bigger problem. But,
yeah, well, I'm still learning SOQL, so
yeah, obviously. But regardless, that time is separate from the CPU time. And even better news, if there's any doubt that we're just replaced one limit with another, we've actually done tests on our end. And we've actually looked at every single line of our billions of lines on Apex code, and no current code anywhere in our entire ecosystem comes even close to these 10-second and 60-second limits. So trust me, the CPU sort of meter will not affect any of your running code. Just we should rejoice that the governor limit for statement limits have been removed, which is awesome.
Yeah. So you're saying we've actually looked ahead on this one and didn't just release it. We've actually made sure no one's going to hit it.
Exactly. And really, I mean, if you're wondering why do we have this limit at all, it's really just to, prevent cases where you like have an infinite loop or something in your Apex code, right? We do have to monitor for those kind of rogue sort of edge corner cases. But other than that, you really shouldn't ever hit this CPU meter that we have.
Or I created the SOQL statement for you, one of the two.
Well, that's right. I don't know about your code line, but any other Apex code should be fine. Some new database methods, get updated, get deleted. This kind of brings Apex up to parity with the SOAP API. SOAP API has had these methods for a while. You can get recently deleted and updated records for a given S object for a given time frame. Merchandise is the custom object you see here in this example. So really helpful for integration type use cases. Also, a database.merge method has been added. And then finally, we have some new methods and classes added in Apex that let you introspect and query the metadata associated with a QuickAction. So for those unfamiliar with that terminology, QuickAction is the same as a chatter publisher action, which Ryan is going to talk about in much more detail in a minute. But in Windows 14, starting Windows 14 in Apex, you can now introspect all metadata related to a chatter publisher action, like what are the quick actions associated with an S object or global actions, describe the layout, etc., all via Apex. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Ryan, to walk us through some awesome Canvas updates.
So just really quickly, for those of you that are unfamiliar with Canvas, we've released it a few revs back, and really the easiest way to think of it is a collection of open source JavaScript libraries that allow you to really take any application you've written with any language and integrate it or bring it into Salesforce in such a way that it behaves just like a native application or a native extension or a native part of Salesforce. So it is a very powerful feature. And we've continued to innovate across the canvas as well in part for that reason. There's a couple of things that we've introduced with Winter 14 that I think are going to be very huge here. And let's talk about them just briefly. The first is the ability to publish or to surface, if you will, your Canvas application within a publisher action. So right from your chatter feed, the chatter publisher, you have the ability to include a Canvas application. So we introduced publisher actions in summer 13. Everybody, we got really good feedback on that, a lot of positive statements from the developer community. We've taken this now a step further in that you now have the ability to take any existing Canvas application, really technically any enterprise application, make it a Canvas application, bring that into the publisher, and interact with that application right from the chatter publisher. So you can think of these as really a nice way to not only give your enterprise or legacy apps a collaborative voice vis-a-vis chatter, but now you can put that functionality directly in the publisher itself. So let's take a look. My slides are a little out of order here, but that's one thing I want to show you here with the Canvas. So let's take a look at how we would do that. I'm going to do two things in this demo. One, I'm going to basically show you how you would enable this in Winter 14. And then secondly, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the code and some of the events and actions that are exchanged between the publisher and your Canvas app. So what I've done here is I've simply gone into setup down to my Canvas app previewer. I'm just going to create a new Canvas app really quickly here. We'll just call this Webinar 14 example. A little under budgeted and understaffed in the creativity department here today. And let me put in my Heroku credentials.
So in this sample, you're hosting the Canvas app on a Heroku, but again, that's not obviously required for Canvas. You can host it anywhere. In fact, you might already have an existing web app hosted internally.
Yeah, that's correct. Actually, I might already have an existing web app, and I timed out here while we're waiting. So sorry, I usually refresh. Just give me one sec here, guys. Again, working without a net here, people.
Live demo.
Yeah, so to your point, Sandeep, yeah, we do this for simplicity's sake because it's much easier to, integrate with an app running on Heroku here, but it can be any application, anywhere. So if we look at this example that was just created, you'll see that it's using the basic Java Heroku quick start template. So it's not really, super functional other than just being able to post to Chatter. But what's important here is I want to show you taking this application now and putting it in the publisher is pretty straightforward. So if I go down now and look at my connected apps, we'll see another benefit of creating an application this way using the Heroku Quick Start is it automatically puts all of the application plumbing in place for me. But now, if I edit this and scroll down to the bottom here in the Canvas app settings, you'll see a couple of interesting things have been added for those of you that are familiar with working with Canvas. For those that aren't, it's all new. Woohoo! So the first is I can now choose Publisher as a location, and secondly, I can choose to create my actions automatically. So let me do those two things. And now, if I go look at my global actions, which is where I would define my global publisher actions, you'll see that it automatically creates that new action for me when I selected A, put it in the publisher, and B, create the action for me. So now, if I go and simply modify my publisher layout, specifically my global publisher layout, all I have to do is essentially add that action to the publisher layout. And when I save it, I now have the ability to include it. And there it is. So pretty straightforward. So this example, again, it doesn't really do much. This is just a simple Canvas application. And the reason why it's not really working right here is what I'm leading into with the second important point. So with the inclusion of Canvas apps and publisher actions, we've added a new, that's the right way to say it, event model and some new JavaScript functions within the Canvas SDK that allows your application to explicitly work within that lifecycle. So let's take a look at that. I've actually created another application to highlight this. So Sandeep, when you were saying earlier, you don't have a lot of really deep front-end design skills. As you can see, I don't suffer from that problem. I've got mad wicked.
That's blindingly obvious. You're a great designer, man.
I'm telling you. So I'm thinking I'm going to go look at those mobile templates after this webinar and see if I can modify them a little bit here for regular use. So let's take a look at this relative to the code. So what I've done here is I've created, again, just a very simple Java application. It's also being hosted on Heroku just for simplicity's sake. And this Java application is using the Java SDK for Canvas apps. Again, there's different SDKs for different languages. You're not by any stretch restricted just to using Java here. So a couple of things that are important. One, for those of you that are familiar with building Canvas applications, you'll notice that there's still a lot of similarity in how I bootstrap all this. But what's a little bit different now is within this application, I'm also defining the events that I'm listening to. So what I've done is I've actually backed really all the functionality in this within a separate JavaScript. And it's real simple. First of all, I just hard code my itinerary data. But then secondly, down here, I actually define the events that I'm going to subscribe to. So when you look at things like setup panel, show panel, this is basically the eventing model where the publisher talks back to your Canvas application, right? So it's actually sending these notifications to your Canvas application, complete in many cases with data that's coming back from that chatter feed or from Salesforce. Again, that's one of the benefits of the Canvas application framework is you can use any API, REST, SOAP, chatter, etc., to exchange data back and forth. And it's bidirectional, right? So not only can I receive events from within the publisher to my application, but I also have the ability to send notifications from my Canvas app to chatter. So let's take a look at what I mean by that really quickly. So you'll notice the way that I have this set up is as soon as I select something, you'll notice that the share button just became active, right? You saw that?
I saw it.
So the way I have this set up is basically handled in this function. And again, it's really simple. As soon as somebody clicks it or I get that click event, I'm basically sending the notification back to the publisher, set valid for submit, which is basically saying, okay, I'm now ready to share or ready to publish what I have in the application inside the chatter feed. So if I hit share, I now basically see my itinerary. And all I'm doing, by the way, what happened there was another callback, right? If you go down here and look, so I showed you where I registered for the callbacks, but down here in my handlers, this is where I'm actually doing something with it. And we missed the callback there. Basically, when I hit share, it made a callback here, which said essentially, hey, you know, this event, my action within my event on get payload was share. So I'm basically just calling another function, which prints the details of that hard-coded itinerary, which is why we see what we see right there. And again, if you were to look at this, you can see all the events right here going back and forth between the publisher and my application. So it's pretty easy to trace and track through this as you're going along for the most part. And of course, you know, different things I could do different lifecycle events here. For example, you know, if I wanted to create a new one, and in this case, I put these buttons in here, these checkboxes in here just to, you know, do some interesting things. But if I wanted to do a approval, you notice that my output's a little different here. And the reason being is I just fired off a different event. In this case, that callback on get payload actually said, hey, this is an approval post. So it's displaying this, which is, you know, pretty anticlimactic for the most part, but where the power of this resides in the fact that now the approval could be kicked back to my Canvas application, my Java app in this case. It could go through the normal, you know, business logic rules, etc., for approving the itinerary on that server or on that other application space, approve it, and then publish that information back into the chatter feed through the publisher action, which says, okay, you know, Ryan, your trip to Las Vegas was approved. So pretty powerful.
That's awesome. I mean, you can basically now, you know, write any web app in any language, host it anywhere, and then simply drop it into a user's chatter feed. Not only that, have two-way communication, as you just showed, between that app and the chatter and the rest of the chatter Chrome, so to speak. So that really is awesome.
Yeah, very awesome indeed. You know, and it gets even better because we're also now supporting the streaming API. So you can couple that with, you know, real-time updates between that application and Salesforce, right? So your Canvas app now has the ability to create push topics, subscribe to push topics, etc., and collaborate that way as well. And when you combine that even more with some of the other features that we introduced, like the pub sub model, for example, in Summer 13, yeah, you're right. You have just a lot of power now within your applications. You can certainly rule the enterprise from within Chatter. There's a few miscellaneous updates that are also worth mentioning in the Winter 14 release. One, I don't know if those of you who have built declarative workflows in the past, which I'm going to assume is probably everybody listening, have been stonewalled, sandbagged, stymied, flummoxed, bewildered, befuddled, whatever, with the fact that you cannot include the user object inside of a workflow. Well, so now in Winter 14, we're working towards changing that. So we have a new beta feature that's coming out that allows you to actually build workflow around the user object. This is really powerful if you think about it, right? Because I've worked with customers over the years who have built these types of workflows that require user interaction or user object interaction. And the way they got around that limitation was typically by, you know, building other triggers or some other Apex code called some other mechanism that sort of handled that user interaction or functionality. So I won't quite say it was a hack, but it certainly wasn't as, you know, natural or seamless as it felt it should have been. So now you have the ability to start to use the user object within those types of workflows without having to build not only the workflow, but also triggers and other classes and keep all that straight and test it and debug it and maintain it, etc. So very, very powerful feature here. There are going to be a few limitations during the beta. You know, one of the ones that come to mind is the fact that tasks aren't going to be supported directly with the workflow, with the user object for workflows. There are others. Certainly, you know, read the release notes for those. They'll detail very specifically, you know, what to be aware of. as well as ideas and thoughts around that. But again, this is powerful, and I'm thinking from a use case perspective, a lot to do with provisioning. Things like, maybe you create a new user, or you hire a new person, you create a new user for them. Maybe as part of that, you're going to now send a welcome email to them, maybe links to training resources, etc. Or even as roles or profiles, etc. change, maybe you want to capture that and send notifications as well. And Sandeep, I would believe there's probably, you're going to talk about security here in a minute, but I would imagine there's probably now some pretty interesting security things you can do as a result of this as well, yes?
You sure can. You can do user provisioning, deprovisioning processes, and a whole lot more. Absolutely.
Yeah, very, very exciting. We've made a couple of changes to sandboxes. One is just simply a name change. We're now renaming the configuration sandboxes to Developer Pro. One thing that is happening to all of our sandboxes is that they are getting bigger, and as we all know, bigger is better. So this is going to allow you basically to work with more data in both Developer Pro as well as your developer sandboxes. So Developer Pros are going to allow you to select up to, or allow you to populate up to a gig of data. Developers were increasing from 100 to 200 megs. We briefly mentioned the Environment Hub and the fact that it was going to be a pilot when it came out in summer 13. It's now GA. For those of you unfamiliar with the Environment Hub, it's basically a tool that lets you from a single centralized location, i.e. one Salesforce org, actually connect to, access, and manage multiple or additional Salesforce orgs. So it drastically simplifies the management and administration of multiple orgs. And of course, this is very beneficial and very handy for customers. And I know there's quite a lot of them that are using multiple orgs to support maybe different business units or different departments, possibly different instances because of merger and acquisitions, etc. Or maybe you just have a more complex and sophisticated sandbox arrangement for development and testing. So this should now help you tremendously manage some of those external orgs within your environment. Not to be outdone, we've also made a number of API updates. This, Sandeep, is another one of those hold on to your hat ones, right? We mentioned back in the previous webinar that we were doing a very limited pilot of our analytics API, and this was demoed, and the one response that was almost unanimous across the developer community was, holy smokes, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but holy smokes, got to get me some of that. How do I get my hands on it? So the good news is now, in Winter 14, it is finally available. It is generally available. So this is something that, as a developer now, if you've been waiting for it, and I know a lot of you have been anxiously anticipating this one, it will be generally available inside of your org. So now you can integrate report data into your apps to your heart's content.
So develop your reports and dashboards point and click, but then as a developer, access that data via JSON and REST and just put any charting or any UI on top of it.
That's right.
Whatever. That's awesome.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, right? Because that's where a lot of the power of that and flexibility of that comes into play, being able to swap out your different charting libraries, the different ways that you can programmatically actually grab the data now, right?
Yep.
So yeah, absolutely. Very, very, very powerful API. I'm going to go out on a limb here, put on my big Swami prediction hat, and I'm going to say this one's going to probably be one of the bigger APIs in terms of adoption moving forward. With regards to our bulk API, change here is we've basically increased the number of submitted batches from 2,000 to 3,000 within the 24-hour period. So the time period is still the same. We've just increased by 1,000 the number of batches that you can submit. We've also made some additional enhancements specifically to the streaming API. These are really more about performance and stability. Really, in summary of this, pretty straightforward. We've basically increased the number of everything, right? So the number of concurrent clients, the number of events, and the number of topics. Just really quickly, basically the maximum number of topics is going to be 1,000 for Unlimited Edition, 500 for Enterprise, and basically 10 for everything else. The events have been bumped up to 1 million. for Unlimited Edition, 200K for Enterprise, and then 10,000 for everyone else. And we've also increased the topic, so I almost forgot that one, to 50. So quite a bit of increase there for the streaming API. One thing that we've also introduced, which I think is pretty neat, is the concept of filtered subscriptions. So now, with the filtered subscription, when you subscribe to a channel, you can actually reduce the number of event notifications that you get on that channel by basically putting an expression on the SOQL that you attach to that channel with. So you basically, it's real simple, you're basically putting an AND or an OR around that subscription URL, or to the subscription URL within that SOQL statement. So filtering is very, very nice in that regard. All right, so Sandeep, of all the greatness that we've just gone through, I'm going to now turn it back over to you to take us home.
Thank you, sir. So a great new pilot feature that we are adding in Winter 14 is flexible API limits. So pilot, meaning you have to have it enabled. It's not turned on by default. But if you do have it enabled, what this lets you do is basically exceed your API request limit, whatever it is for your specific org, by up to 50% within a given 24-hour period. So let's say your exact API limit for each org depends on the type of org and the number of user licenses, etc. But whatever it is, let's say you have 100K worth of API calls in a day. If you have this pilot enabled, you can go up to 150K on that given day without any penalty, no errors, nothing. You can just simply scale up 50% over your limit. Now, these limits only apply to the SOAP and REST APIs, so that's important to remember. And also, this is, the reason behind this this pilot is to help you manage unexpected peaks of traffic that you might have for your org, right? So this is not a way for you to permanently increase your API limits by 50%. That would be nice, wouldn't it? But this is really more for you to help you handle unexpected peaks without getting penalized for them. So if you consistently, exceed your API limits, then that's probably not a good thing, and we'll probably have Ryan call you and talk to you, have a talk. But other than that, it's a great way to deal with those unexpected peaks of traffic. But also the best way, obviously, to avoid any getting yourself into trouble when it comes to limits is never exceed them. So we've now made that easier in Winter 14. We've added a limit info header to the SOAP and REST API. So every time you make a REST or SOAP API call in Winter 14, as part of the response, in the header, we actually tell you how many API calls you have remaining for the 24-hour period. And we've also added, as a pilot, a brand new resource to the REST API. So you can simply do a get to /services/data/v version of the API /limits, and you will get back a simple JSON response that tells you all your limits, not just the API, but other limits in your org as well, how much, how many callouts limits, for example, you have, etc. It'll tell you both the total number that you have, as well as how many of that limit you have remaining for a given time frame. So that's really neat. You can, as part of your integration logic, you can actually look at this response and change your integration pattern or take corrective action if you're close to meeting your API limit in any case. Great new pilot to talk about around field history retention in Winter 14. So in previous releases, we had indicated that we would delete field history data for a certain small subset of orgs if it was greater than 18 months. But again, that was only supposed to be applicable for a certain subset of orgs. But as you can imagine, we got a lot of feedback based on that. And as a result of that feedback, we're actually no longer doing that. So just to be clear, no field history data for any org, any Salesforce org, no matter when it's created, whenever, no field history data, no matter how old it is, will be deleted by Salesforce. And not only that, as part of this pilot, we're basically, via this enterprise SOAP and tooling APIs, we're giving you the ability to tell us how much field history data you want maintained for what S objects, right? So you can actually, we let you control how much field history you want us to maintain. And this is just the start of some really exciting initiatives around big data here at Salesforce. Under the covers, it's using some really exciting new technology for us. And as I said, watch this space over the next couple of releases. We're going to be doing some really interesting and cool things around big data. But here, this is the start of it via this field history data retention pilot. Security updates. I could easily, if not me, at least Pat could at least spend an entire webinar talking about the security updates in Winter 14. But let me just start with this one, probably my favorite. Now you can completely customize your login page in Salesforce and have it look something like this. This is a real live org, right? This is not a screenshot. You can customize the backend, the background color, customize some icon. You can customize what URL. This is basically an iframe on the right. You can tell us what URL should be shown in that iframe. So completely white label Salesforce for your users in some way. They won't, there's no way for them to know really they're logging into Salesforce if that's the kind of use case you're interested in. So really great feature in Winter 14. Also have two-factor authentication, especially for mobile use cases. So in addition to the user entering their username and password, you can also, for a certain subset of users or profiles, you can also make them enter a randomly generated token. So, that much extra layer of security has been added in Winter 14. Support for OpenID Connect providers like Amazon, Google, and PayPal to log into your Salesforce org. So instead of having your users log in with a Salesforce credential, you can have them log in via their Amazon, Google, or PayPal logins. And this really, sort of interesting and important use case would be for like a B2C use case on a portal or a site, right? So great new feature that you should check out. Two-way mutual auth, so you get two-way SSL. Client certs can be sent to Salesforce and authenticated, as well as using frontdoor.jsp to log into Salesforce.
Very nice.
Very nice indeed. So before we turn it over to Q&A, let me quickly point out some upcoming events that we have. Great new series of webinars around the Service Cloud Console on August 28th, as well as building iOS apps using the mobile SDK on September 5th, and then the mobile code talk on September 12th. So any of one of those topics catch your fancy, please sign up for those webinars. So before we start Q&A, let me just quickly point out that we do love getting feedback from you guys. Tell us how we did, good or bad. I'm sure I did great and Ryan did terrible. So tell us. There is a simple bit.ly link there, bit.ly/Winter14 survey. I believe if you attended the webinar, you'll also be emailed that link. So, but in all seriousness, we do really value this feedback, and we do really look at it and try and improve our product and our offerings based on that feedback. So please give us your feedback. All right, Ryan, what do we have in store for questions?
All right, so we have some really good questions. A lot of them have been answered as we've gone along, so thank you to our really smart expert staff that have been fielding a lot of these. Let me just run a couple of them by you really quickly. So first one relates to server-side view state, and the question is, I haven't seen this in the release notes myself, so maybe you know, but are there any future plans to increase the view site state with state size rather with server-side view states? So big, imagine a big fat safe harbor slide behind me as I speak. Not really. I don't think it's the server-side view state is not really our attempt to increase the view state per se. But that said, who knows? Based on feedback and results of this pilot, we consider that. But really, server-side view state is really more meant to help you sort of control the performance of your Visualforce page a little better. It's not really to help you increase your view state size. If anything, you should actively be trying to reduce your view state size, client or server side. View state is still affects page performance. So you should really be considering things like JS remoting where it makes sense, etc., using transient, the transient keyword, etc., to reduce your view state, if anything. Yeah, actually, I was going to mention the transient piece, right? Actually taking the time to thoroughly, intelligently look at the data being sent back and forth and figure out, do I really need to send this around? So, yeah, great point. Yeah, to your big safe harbor, I think instead of a safe harbor, that one needs like a whole safe seaside community. That one's huge.
Right. Moving right along, I see a question around pass-through attributes, and somebody asking, is the HTML pass-through attributes only supported on Output panel? That's actually what's changed in Winter 14 is previous to this release, it was somewhat limited in terms of the tags that you could use pass-through attributes in. With Winter 14, that list has expanded a huge, whole lot. So there's now, the release notes has the exact list of Visualforce components that now support this pass-through tags. But bottom line, it's a huge list now, and most of the Visualforce standard library now supports these HTML pass-through attributes. Not all, but most of them.
Yep. Good question. There seems to be a little confusion. A couple of questions are still asking about other limits. I think relative to the announcement that the governor limit is being removed. I think it's important to understand that everything else, every other governor limit is still in place, right? The only thing that's been removed is for this one the state governor limit. So everything else, DML, SOQL, whatever, those limits, runtime limits, yes, they're still in place. So certainly keep that in mind.
Developer Pro, the login for Developer Pro is login or test.salesforce. It's a sandbox, so it means it's always test.salesforce.com. All we've done is just renamed configuration to Developer Pro. Nothing else changes. And we bumped up the size of it. That's the other change. But the login URL and everything, none of that changes. It's still test.salesforce.com.
Yeah, and also throwing a safe harbor on this as a follow-up question to that is whether they're going to automatically be converted for existing sandboxes. Wasn't overly clear to me in the discussions and things that we've seen through the release information. So that's certainly something that either keep an eye on, and you'll see when we provision the instance in your sandboxes if they change, or certainly talk with your local sales team about as well. I wouldn't be surprised. This is the safe harbor part if it didn't maybe show up like a different SKU or something moving forward. So.
Right. Question around workflow around for the users. Maybe you know this, Ryan. Is will there be a time-based workflow rules allowed for on the user object? I believe so. I don't believe seeing that in the release notes. They're saying that's not allowed. So unless you think otherwise, I believe that is correct. You are allowed time-based workflow rules.
Yep, that was not one of the. That's not one of the explicit limitations that I've seen called out. So yeah.
Okay, so that's awesome. One question around, I guess not related to the webinar necessarily, but are there any plans for an Apex debugger? If you didn't know this already, that we already have a debugger in the developer console. You already have the ability to set checkpoints, for example, and inspect heap dumps, etc. You do not have step-by-step through sort of debugging, perhaps, because that's really almost impossible to do in a multi-tenant environment, but you have the next best thing. And so if you haven't checked out the developer console and checkpoints and all that stuff, please do so. We even have a webinar on that whole topic on Developerforce that you can check out.
Absolutely.
Maybe one more, last one, Ryan?
Yeah, so we were talking about the new database methods. Do you know if the new database methods count against any of the limits?
The limits meaning Apex?
Get updated, get deleted.
Not sure which limits. I mean, yes, they all apply to any Apex governor limits. All the Apex governor limits still apply. Yeah. But there's no special limit added to that method. It's just a new method added to the database system class. So all your regular Apex governor limits apply, but there is no new limit if that was the question.
Good.
All right, so with that, we'll call it a day. Thank you so much for everyone who joined us. Thank you so much, Ryan. And we'll see you back here shortly.
Take care, everyone. It's great speaking with you again. Look forward to seeing you out there in the community.